Yo, what's up, guys? That was fucking weird doing that. That was. Oh yeah. Okay, we're back. um, yeah, part two. Well, it's kind of like part 1.5 for us, but we're just gonna carry on straight in there. Just jump straight in. Let's go.
During the early morning attacks on the Kido Butai, a more serious situation was developing in the high command with Nagumo and his staff. Shortly after 0700 hours, Nagumo received Tomonaga's report that a second strike was needed. The news was unpleasant, but had actually been expected. How could a force of 72 bombers, half of which were armed with medium-sized bombs, be expected to neutralize a fortified base? He could allow Tomonaga's flight to return, refuel and rearm, and then send them back. But of course, this would take hours to complete, allowing the Americans to lick their wounds and reform their defense. This would contribute further casualties. Or alternatively, he could strike the Americans while they were still down. He could use his reserve aircraft, who at the moment stood idly by doing nothing. But these were exclusively off the table because Yamamoto had ordered them to be reserved in case of an enemy carrier task force appearing. But surely, Yamamoto wasn't expecting Nagumo to fight an entire battle with only half his strength. I mean, come on, this was tantamount to making Nagumo fight this entire battle with one arm tied behind his back. And this right here had been the fault in the whole Midway plan. There simply weren't enough planes. There weren't enough planes to do the dual mission, to both attack Midway and to keep a reserve in case enemy carriers appeared. So Nagumo looked at the maps, and by now his air searches were reaching their maximum range, and so far nothing had been found or reported. So why not use these planes for the second strike? And let's not forget that at this moment a Maverick plane from Midway had just tried to suicide crash into his bridge. Midway was clearly still a threat, and as long as its airbase was operational, it posed a danger to his carriers. This is what probably prompted Nagumo's consequent decision. Midway had to be neutralized. Thus, at 0715, Nagumo went against Yamamoto's orders and ordered the rearmament of his reserve aircraft.
So what would you do at this point if you were Nagumo? If I'm Nagumo and I'm looking at the plans and I'm not seeing any aircraft carriers, I'm probably going to attack the reserve force because that's just in my temperament. I think it'd be better to knock it out right now rather than letting them rearm and deal with the casualties. Would you have made the decision to fall back and wait, or would you have sent them in, given the information that you had at the time? Let me know.
The rearmament process began in the hangars below. Torpedoes were removed and land bombs installed. The dive bombers weren't affected by this because they were armed once they had been spotted on the flight decks. So in reality, this chaotic, fast-paced rearming process was happening only in the hangars of the 1st Carrier Division. All in all, this process was going to take about an hour and a half to complete. Then, 30 minutes into the rearmament process, at 0745, Nagumo received a report. That Tone plane, the one that had been delayed, ran across an American force. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface units. Nagumo was stunned. He quickly cancelled and reversed the rearmament order and took stock of the situation. It will basically boil down to two options for him. Send an immediate strike right now, or send a strike after Tomonaga's planes were recovered. This is what is most commonly known as Nagumo's dilemma. So I will ask the viewer to put themselves in Nagumo's shoes for a while to better understand his conundrum. And I'll let you know, it's not as simple as it looks. Many factors have to be considered. Keep in mind that you would have had only 15 minutes to decide on the correct course of action. So let's first dive into the aggressive option, which is attacking immediately.
So I'm just thinking here, I'm remembering what he said earlier about once the Americans launch their strike, you have to wait for it to finish before you launch your strike. So if the Americans go first, then you're left utterly defenseless, and you only have to rely on evasive maneuvers. But if you take the initiative, you don't know how well their defense is. I don't know.
So let's first dive into the aggressive option, which is attacking immediately. Okay, first off, the sighting didn't even make sense. Based on the location, Tony number 4 plane was never supposed to come across it. Either he wasn't where he was supposed to be, or the task force location was incorrect. This brings up the composition factor. It was unknown. What did 10 ships mean? It could be a carrier task force, or they could simply be auxiliary ships. Nagumo didn't know, and this was unsettling. What if he sends a strike and the sighting proved to be just destroyers or support ships? This had actually happened to Admiral Takagi a month earlier in the Battle of Coral Sea. Nagumo did not want a repeat of that mistake. But there were 2 additional alarming clues about the sighting. Why was there a force 240 miles northeast of Midway? There would be no reason for a force to be in this location unless it contained a carrier. And if it was a carrier, it would be in a prime position to unleash an attack on the Japanese's flank. And more importantly, why was it steering into the wind? As it was known, it was procedure for aircraft carriers to steam into the wind when launching their aircraft. Nagumo and his staff apparently saw the validity of these 2 clues, but in the end came to the conclusion that it was most likely just a surface force. Second, the rearmament process wasn't as devastating as many believe. The Val dive bombers weren't affected by this, only the Kates. 34 had been armed with torpedoes, but now only 19 were ready. 15 had been switched to land bombs. So instead of having a full strike complement of 78 planes, he now only had 64 planes properly armed. Although that's only a difference of 15. 64 planes were more than enough to sink any task force encountered. And here's the third factor, time. Nagumo was restricted on time because Tomonaga's force would soon be arriving at about 0815 and they would be low on fuel. Meaning they had to be landed quickly unless they were forced to ditch at sea. This was the worst timing ever for Nagumo. Japanese flight decks were restricted in that they could only do one operation at a time. They could either launch, recover, or spot aircraft. Thus, Nagumo had to decide, either launch his counterstrike now or recover the Midway strike. The fuel situation was troubling. If he didn't want to lose any more planes through ditching, he needed to finish the recovery by 0845, the latest. Why 0845? Well, let's take a look and work backwards to calculate the time constraints. It's 0745 now. Tomonaga's planes had enough fuel to fly overhead until about 0915. It would take 20 to 30 minutes to land them. That makes 0845 the threshold. You better finish your launching process by this time or else start losing aircraft by ditching. This leaves Nagumo with an hour of leeway, and it took about 45 minutes to spot and launch an airstrike. So if he wants to take this opportunity to launch an attack with what he's got, he can. But he would have to start the process by 0800 the latest. Thus, this is the 15-minute window Nagumo got to make a decision. Jeez, talk about being under pressure, huh?
That is pressure. Jesus, I'm stressed watching it. And this is with all the information laid out. Like, you know it wasn't laid out like that for him. It would have been coming in on reports from bits of paper, people telling you something here, a screen there with like really old tech. Man, I don't envy this guy.
Was an attack feasible? Yes, it was. It would be a tight squeeze, but if he began now, by 0800, by 0845 his counterstrike would have taken off and Tomonaga's planes, who would be flying on fumes at this point, would then land. However, scratch that hypothetical because at 0753 the Kido Butai came under attack by those dive bombers. Theoretically, he could still launch a strike while under attack, although this was rarely done in combat and it was extremely risky. But one thing was for sure, that 45-minute launching process would have definitely stretched out closer to the length of an hour. As a result, the possibility of Tomonaga's air group having to commit a mass ditch would become likely. Disposing of perhaps dozens of aircraft at the start of a battle was unthinkable. So Nagumo had to decide, does he attack this unknown target based in this sketchy, unconfirmed location with some of his planes carrying the wrong ordnance and risk losing additional planes by unnecessary ditching? Or he could simply wait until Tomonaga's strike had landed. and then after recovery, launch a full balanced strike at whatever this target is with the proper ordnance. This was clearly the ultra-safe choice that offered no unnecessary risk.
Send a strike after recovering from Taganaga's force. I mean, that's assuming that you don't get attacked in this time then. Okay.
But what made Nagumo think he still had time? Well, if we take the reported position at face value, the location meant that even if this force contained a carrier, it wouldn't have been within strike range of an escorted strike. The Americans would have to close the distance and then launch a strike, which meant it wouldn't reach Nagumo's carriers until about 10:15, some 2 hours from now. Thus, Nagumo would have the time to launch his own counterstrike before he himself was reached. So I asked the viewer to press pause and consider the options. Honestly, with all this information at hand, what would you have done?
Well, at first I said I would have already attacked Midway before we realised that there was a force near. The thing that I really don't want to have to do is ditch planes. It's just such a huge unnecessary waste. I think I would go for a sender strike after recovering from Taganaga's force, but then you do open yourself up for a preemptive strike. I'm going to go with this one. Let me know what you guys picked. This is stressful to watch, man.
With the conservative mindset that Nagumo had, it's not too difficult to imagine which course of action he took. He went for the safest option. He would recover his planes first, and then launch a powerful, well-balanced strike at the enemy. Nagumo opted for this choice because it promised mass and coordination over anything else. For as much as Nagumo has been criticized, his decision was doctrinal. If any other Japanese commander had been in his place, they would have also made the same decision. So let's continue the saga.
Okay.
Down below, the crews in the hangars worked feverishly to change the Kates with land bombs back again to torpedoes. In the midst of all the chaos, the bombs were not stored away safely. Instead, they were laid haphazardly around the hangar.
Oh my god.
Above in the bridge, Nagumo waited impatiently for further information. And it wasn't until 0820 that identification of the surface units finally came through. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. This was dreadful news. Well, you may ask, why not attack now that you have definite confirmation of a carrier? Well, it would still take 45 minutes to get the aircraft out of the hangar, spotted, and launched. Meanwhile, Tomonaga's air group would all run out of fuel and crash into the sea. And just there, you lost 97 planes. Also, the strike would have to go unescorted since all the fighters had been brought up to assist in the air defense of the mobile force during the recent attacks. So the option of launching an unescorted strike, which was bound to receive heavy losses and lose 97 planes through mass ditching, wasn't seriously going to be considered by Nagumo. Basically, it was too late for Nagumo to attack now. He had made his bed, and now he had to lay in it.
So I'm just trying to think, is it for... do we know for certain that the Americans know the Japanese are here? But I feel like they do because of that rogue Sparta plane earlier on, plus the battle that's just happened, so these would have communicated with Midway, I'm assuming, and given, estimated coordinates.
He would have to wait. Thankfully for him, the last morning attacks died down by 0837. The Kido Butai finally got a break from all the morning attacks and could now begin recovering the aircraft. From 0837 to 0910, Tomonaga's strike force was safely landed. While one can sympathize with the predicament Nagumo was in, there was a decision that was questionable. The Kido Butai changed course to the northeast after recovering the airstrike. Why? This was not necessary. Japanese planes outranged the Americans. There was no reason to close the gap. It would just make it quicker for your opponent to reach you. A wiser decision would have been to head northwest, still allowing you to strike back, but keeping you at the extreme striking range of the Americans. With the last of his aircraft recovered, Nagumo was now free to begin spotting his planes on the decks. It was looking good for Nagumo. All he needed now was a 45-minute uninterrupted window, and a powerful counterstrike would be dealt to the Americans. However, events would soon foil his high hopes.
Do you reckon that was out of arrogance that he turned into the enemy's range, or was it just negligence? Could be a bit of both.
Events would soon foil his high hopes. Off to the north, enemy aircraft were spotted. Damn, instead of preparing to launch his strike, Nagumo would now be forced into evasive maneuvers and focus on protecting his carriers from the forthcoming assault. These 15 Devastator torpedo bombers were coming in and with no escorts. They would be easy prey for the 30 fighters that were protecting the mobile force. The 4 carriers turned to port to present their stern to the incoming attackers. What followed next was a stern pursuit, which put the Devastators at a disadvantage because of their slow speed. They could barely break 100 knots while carrying their ordnance. The fighters swarmed over them with impunity and they were cut to pieces. 2/3 were intercepted before they were even close to making their run-ins. Only 3 got close enough to threaten the Soru, but ultimately only one, just one of the 15, was able to launch its torpedo. However, not only did his torpedo miss, but the pilot was shot down himself. The attack had lasted about 15 minutes. Although the Japanese probably didn't know it at the moment, they had just destroyed an entire squadron, and there were no hits to stand for it. There would only be one survivor of the 30 aircrew who participated in this heroic attack. But as soon as that attack was over, at 0940, another one began, this time from the south. It was at this time that Nagumo had to have realized that his mobile force was in serious trouble. It was imperative that Nagumo get his planes off the deck before being hit himself. All he needed was a 45-minute window to launch an airstrike. But during attacks, he couldn't launch a strike because his flight decks were solely occupied with the replenishment of the combat air patrol fighters. To add to the mess, he was in a dangerous state because at the moment he was at his most vulnerable. His planes were fully fueled, armed, and parked densely within the hangars of his carriers.
Jesus.
And more disturbingly, it was clear that these were carrier-based bombers. Obviously, the reported location of the carriers had been wrong this whole time. They had actually been 55 miles closer when they were spotted at 0728. Thus, his mobile force had been within American strike range this entire time. This is a clear example of the fog of war. Just like at Coral Sea, the Japanese commander had made a decision based on the information at hand. Although unbeknownst to him, the information had been incorrect. Sometimes you can just plain out have bad luck. One thing was for sure, Japanese scout planes needed to practice their ship identification and spotting skills.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh well, maybe Nagumo can dodge this attack as well. The 14 torpedo bombers came in, unescorted. The 2 divisions had selected the Kaga as their target, and they were trying to do an anvil attack on the slow carrier. But it would be difficult to do with their slow lumbering planes. Initially, they came in unopposed, but then Zeros swarmed over them and the rightmost division took the brunt of the attack. 2 torpedoes were launched, but the Kaga dodged them.
I think this is just, I feel like this part of the battle is experience versus, new pilots. And I feel like this is serving the Japanese really well. But I feel like this may not go so well for too long. You can't rely on experience, this much. He's using it as a clutch at this point. A crutch, sorry.
2 torpedoes were launched, but the Kaga dodged them. With additional Zeros added to the fray, only 3 torpedoes from the other division were released. But just as before, the Kaga skillfully avoided them as well. Once again, an attack had been pressed on gallantly by the Americans, but it had been ineffective. 9 of the 14 bombers were shot down, and of these 5 survivors, 1 had to ditch on the return trip. Only 1 Zero was lost. And when that attack finished, guess what? Another one began.
Oh my
You
God.
have got to be kidding. For the last 50 minutes, these piecemeal attacks, although as ineffective as they were delaying the launch of the desperately needed Japanese counterstrike. And more frightening, judging this to be the 3rd torpedo squadron, there definitely had to be more than one carrier. Actually, there wasn't just one, there were 3. Boy, was Nagumo in trouble.
Yeah, do you know what I mean?
Also, the Japanese must have asked themselves at this point, where were the dive bombers? If the Devastators had made it this far, an imminent dive bombing attack was sure to come. But something was different with this forthcoming attack. These 12 torpedo bombers came in with an escort of 6 Wildcats.
Okay.
The Zeros set out to intercept them, but little did they know they were in for a surprise. For the first time in the war, the famous Thatch Weave was used, named so by its creator, Jimmy Thatch, who was leading the division. The planes would start in a beam defense position. Once a Zero was on the tail of a Wildcat, the 2 sections would turn towards each other. This allowed one section to get a head-on attack on the chasing Zero.
Oh, brilliant.
It would either kill or brush off the Zeros on your partner's tail. The process could easily be repeated.
And it's obviously called a Thatch
This
Weave.
defensive maneuver stunned the Zero pilots. Up to this point in the war, the Japanese pilots would always come out victorious in dogfights against their opponents. But now, they were the ones getting beaten. 4 Zeros were shot down, and only 1 Wildcat was lost during this interception. Thatch, in his fighter squadron alone, attracted the attention of over 20 Zeros. Many things have to be acknowledged at this point. First, the escort had done an excellent job. 11 of the 12 Devastators were actually able to push through for their run-ins, and this posed a considerable threat to the carriers. This caused the remaining Zeros, who were looking out for any nearby dive bombers, to descend from their high-altitude patrols to shoot down these intruders. Therefore, as we can see, the northeast sector became a magnet, sucking in all the fighters on combat air patrol. Disturbingly, this had the effect of leaving the carriers with no overhead protection. What we are seeing here is a dangerous example of target fixation. All eyes were glued on this developing threat that the situational awareness, that is, keeping a lookout for any other threats, was forgotten. This was leaving the Kido Butai in a vulnerable state. The American bombers carried on, but with fresh Zeros diving from above, the Devastators stood little chance to prevail. The same story played out, and over half were shot down. Eventually, only 5 would end up launching at the Hiru, but the Japanese carriers successfully avoided them. The end result would be that 10 of the 12 torpedo bombers were lost, and 1 of their 4 escorts for no hits. This last torpedo attack probably accounted for about 7 fighters. The time was 10:20. The torpedo attack was halfway through, and as expected, not one had struck home. It was a testament to the prowess of the Japanese pilots. The Kido Butai had been in combat for the last 3 hours and had avoided all the bombs and torpedoes thrown at it, with its evasive maneuvers and its skilled fighters.
But he said there was 3 carriers, right? So that means they could technically have 1 more attack. With dive bombers. Because they haven't arrived. Oh no, they have, sorry. We'll see what happens.
Nagumo had been quite lucky, actually. His mobile force, with no radar, had shot down 53 aircraft at this point and had lost only 11 fighters itself, and there wasn't even a scratch on his ships. But it was precisely at this moment, when all the fighters were down below fighting off this latest assault in the northeast sector, that a new threat emerged, high above. 50 dive bombers were approaching overhead, undetected and unopposed, and coming from 2 different directions. Nagumo's luck had finally run out.
Not going to leave us there. Okay. Man, this is so stressful to watch. Jesus Christ, man.
The Kido Butai had never been faced with defeat before. In the previous 6 months, they had ruled the seas. They had sunk 5 capital ships, a light carrier, 2 cruisers, and half a dozen destroyers. But now, their unbroken string of victory...
Oh, okay. I was surprised that there were British ships in the Pacific Theater.
...would come to an end. These dive bombers weren't rookies like the Midway base bombers. These were the A-team of the Pacific Fleet. and with no opposition,
music, man.
the result would be deadly. From the south came 2 squadrons, and they all teamed up on one carrier, the enormous Kaga. 30 dive bombers began their steep dives from 19,000 feet. The Kaga was practically taken by surprise, and she received 4 hits, one of which landed on the bridge, killing the captain and his staff. The planes, being fully fueled and armed inside the hangar, ignited, causing a chain of secondary explosions. She quickly became an inferno. The Soru was attacked by 13 dive bombers. 3 bombs were placed evenly along the center of her flight deck. All her hangars were hit, and just like the Kaga, the bombs set off a chain of explosions inside the ship. Fires immediately engulfed the carrier.
Oh my god.
It looked as if the Akagi might get off scot-free. However, when the Kaga was being pummeled, 3 dive bombers peeled off at the last moment and went for her. With pure skill, a bomb was dropped in its upper hangar. It didn't seem serious at first. A carrier this big could have certainly survived this single hit. But just like her sister ships, the planes and bombs inside her hangars began to detonate. Thereafter, fire spread uncontrollably, and the Akagi, the flagship of the Kido Butai, was doomed.
Imagine losing 3 carriers like that, just how expensive and how long it takes to make a carrier. And you lose 3, inside. This whole battle encompasses, 4 hours? This attack, 20 minutes maybe? You lose 3 carriers? Jesus Christ.
It's doomed. In less than 5 minutes, history had changed.
5 minutes.
The powerful Kido Butai had been wrecked. Only one had been able to escape destruction, the Hiru. The outcome of the battle now rested upon the shoulders of the Hiru and her elite pilots.
Oh, okay. Jesus Christ, I feel like I've just watched a whole Hollywood movie. That was stressful to watch, man. That was so stressful. But probably one of the most educational 40 minutes I've ever had. Unbelievable. The guy who's made this, Montemaya. Shout out to you, man. That was an amazing video. I really hope we get some Japanese people in the comments, just to let us know what they're taught in school. Are they taught this? What does their education of World War II encompass? I want to get the Americans' opinion as well, from a lot of you guys in the comments. Some of you are in service or had family that served at this part of the war. Definitely let me know, man. This was crazy to watch. This was brilliant to watch, man. Probably tell by my face. Let me know. Peace out. Like, comment, subscribe if you don't mind. It means a lot, man. It really does. Really, really does, honestly. But yeah, man, take it easy, and I'll get the next ones up as soon as possible, when I promise. Peace.